someone said that's me. Great. My talk is actually about AI. It's what everyone wants to hear about. So I actually switched it up at the last second. I'm just kidding. I don't want to bore you guys today. So I'm talking about HTMX. How many of you guys have coded JavaScript? Whoa. Not everybody. What about HTML? How many of you guys have coded HTML? Cool. Yeah, they kind of live together in the browser. And they have this strange relationship going back to when browsers were invented. So HTMX has a couple of ideas that are very important. I should have mentioned, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Everett. I'm actually the CEO of HTMX. For today, I'm the CEO. Here's a couple of the things that are important to HTMX. The first one is why should only elements and form elements be able to make HTTP requests? So if anyone's ever coded straight HTML, there are things that the HTMX people refer to as hypermedia control. And that's usually your links and your form buttons. And that's the only thing that will call a request over the wire to a server. So the actual CEO of HTMX, I guess, came up with this idea of why don't we make it so you can call HTTP requests with everything in a web browser. And then the second one, which I clicked and opened, is why should only click and submit events trigger HTTP requests? I think that was kind of tied into what I already said. Why can you only do get and post requests with the HTML form? There's also put requests, there's delete requests. So you can't do a delete request with a web form. You can't do it with a button for some reason. So people end up using JavaScript to do that. And why should you only be able to replace the entire screen in HTML? That's the last kind of, I guess these are the reasons why HTMX exists. I coded these slides up in HTMX, just so everyone knows. I'll close the code in just a second. We're going to get into it. So does anyone know what HTTP stands for?
Transfer protocol?
Yeah, exactly. It's for transferring hypertext. What does HTML stand for?
Hypertext markup language.
Exactly. So there's a strange idea that the HTMX people that I kind of got sucked into this organization on the internet, kind of a secret society, that you should be sending hypertext over HTTP, which is a kind of a foreign idea in this day and age. Most people send JSON over HTTP, which it's not the JSON transport protocol, it's the hypertext transfer protocol. So the HTMX people are kind of weird. Oh, this is the end of my slides, but okay, but we have a box, and watch this. When you click it, things appear because of HTTP requests. So I did a what? HDAs. Yeah, that's what my talk is about. Hypermedia driven apps. So that's what we're going to be talking about, and I'm going to show you a few of these. Why would you want to do that? Because I was just wanted to use the word webmaster. So I usually introduce myself as like coding since I was 12. So we used to be called webmasters, but now I think people are called engineers who work. I don't know. There's a couple of different things like developers, engineers. We have these like big, powerful titles for people who make websites. But I'm trying to make this word more popular because I feel like webmaster is, it's like you're like a mastering the web. And to do that, you have to know HTML. And we're hoping maybe a little HTMX. And perhaps I want you guys to consider, perhaps you don't need much else other than that to make a hypermedia-driven app. You will still have JavaScript. And how does HTMX do this? It uses attributes that they tag into HTML tag, or you put them into HTML tags, such as HX post, HX swap, HX target. There's a whole bunch of other ones, but pretty much all those can do really cool things. So I was gonna live code you an app, but I feel like I'm running a little long. So let me just take you to my first example, which is the Web 1.0 app. Can we all see that? Is that big enough for everybody? We can see it, right? So this is an Express app in Dino. Sorry. Zoom in for back there. Okay. Let's see. How's that?
Better.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh, DWM, yes. Yeah. Spot. Yeah. So we have a Dino Express app, so we're loading it. We have a database, which I'm using throughout all these apps as I kind of progressively change this from a Web 1.0 app into an HTMX. You might send a render each one of these pages to a render function, and we're going to have a, you can't see that because of the stupid Zoom thing, but if I move it up here, yeah, that's probably better. And then there's another stupid Zoom thing that I can't even see that's blocking that. But let's launch this app and see how it looks. Okay, so this is a website that's based off of the database. And it's kind of how people did things back in the day. We have different routes for everything. So we have, this is my contact page. As I just recently updated this, I am the CEO of HTMX today. And this is my intro, which is, I wanted to use the word information superhighway, which when I was a kid, that's what we called it. But now I'm all grown up. It's 2024. But okay, so something, if you guys are familiar with the internet, one of the most annoying things that happens when you are in an app like this is it refreshes the screen every single time you click these buttons. Now it's kind of hard to tell because my computer is so blazingly fast compared to what I was using in 1999. But HTMX fixes this with a cool little thing that I'm going to show you. So this is my next example. So we're going to throw HTMX in here, which is a JavaScript. And then over here in the body, we're going to throw the attribute HX boost. And what this does is make it so it...
The font again.
Wait, what?
The font again.
Font size. Thank you. What this does is it caches the head of the HTML document. So when you click those buttons, there's no refresh. So I'm going to go ahead and run this next example. And we're not going to notice any difference because my computer is so blazing fast. Okay, so we see the same exact website, but when I click these buttons, it is not refreshing the whole page. Whoa, whoa, guys, this is crazy. Okay. So close out of that, and we're going to go to the next example of what you would do with HTMX. HTMX. My font size is good, right? Okay. So we can take this a little bit farther and not just boost the page. I'm going to go down to the routes. And what happens in this example is when we click the buttons, it's going to just swap in the hypermedia that we've requested. So this initial page gets sent to the browser. We have HTMX, which is a JavaScript. And then we have 3 buttons. And what they do is they do a GET HTTP request to a route. And then you specify a target, which is an ID. I think they call them CSS selectors sometimes. That's on the page already. And we're going to use main over here. You actually can just target main. You don't have to use the ID, but I guess I did that. And then we're going to render some markdown, which I think I did in the other example. So let me just run this. Kill that. So here's my Firefox. Okay. So I changed these to buttons because buttons can't actually do HTTP calls, and that's going to so this is where we get into an HDA, which is the next level of being a webmaster. And what's happening here is instead of it caching the head and the footer of this website, it is just subbing in the content from the server as it does a route request. So these routes, unlike in the first example where it returned the whole page, it's now only returning an HTML snippet, which goes in here. So what do you guys think? Is that cool? Are you guys into it? Well, anyway, we're just doing that with a little attribute. So that's why I'm CEO today of HTMX. So I have a couple other examples. Does anyone have any questions about this so far? Yes.
How are the routes rendered?
How are the routes rendered? In which example? The second, the swap one? Look at those again. So I chose Express for this to try to be as approachable as possible, not use some obscure server-side framework. But in the first case, on the route, on the home route, basically it sends this whole page up there. But then down here, we're only sending markdown rendering of the DB description. That answers the question. Yes.
If you already have them, sorry. Can you show the contents of the DB file?
Yes. Oh, here it is. Okay. And let me move the annoying Zoom thingy. So this is my database, which is just an object. And I could probably edit this if you guys don't like anything in here. But I think it's going to be fine for my talk. Probably for my own website, I would be a little, I don't know, invest a little bit more time. Things. Okay, so I went ahead and took this. Yes.
Do you mind showing the network request? Or if that's coming later, that's fine.
The network request, like what happens when it does a thing. Oh, how do I, like what HTMX is doing?
Yeah, just like bread without tools.
Right. Yeah, how do I do that?
Dev tools.
Yeah,
Open the dev tools.
like on the web page.
Swap. Where do I go, guys?
So and then just click any of the buttons that would fetch something.
Much better.
Let's see what's going on.
That response tab.
Yeah, so it's just sending that, I think, is HTML.
If you toggle the raw in the right side,
That is
literally just a
paragraph. Yeah. So it sends that across the wire. Because it could be sending a JSON object and parsing the JSON, appending it into that area. Yes.
Yeah, so then to recap, basically like on request, it's the HTMX library is intercepting that and just like recognizing that it just has to swap
Yeah.
the DOM node content.
Yeah, it swaps it into the ID, or I think you can do multiple, like you can target all the classes in a document. I haven't taken it to extremes, but I do have a couple of examples that I would like to share that I think are kind of cool. Though there's a lot of crazy things that people are doing with this. Here's one with an API integration. Anything in my way. Oh, there's like this in here. How did that happen? Should have tested all of my. You do have the QR code down there. Okay. Last time I spoke here, I had really crazy QR codes everywhere. So I just might try this out, except the Zoom thing is in the way. So this is an HDA with an API integration that should make my phone ring. If you guys want to try it. Oh. Whoa. So the interesting thing here is that this input form gets sent to the server, and then it sends back this HTML snippet from the server when it gets the request. So anyway, a little bit different than how people would normally do this. Wow, I'm ringing like crazy. This is the most important or the exciting day of my life. Wow, 500 people are calling my phone. Next example. Oh, let's look at the code. Wait, what?
Yeah. How does it work?
How does it work? This stupid Zoom thing over here. Okay, so what we do here is this button is an HX get. That's not as big as we're gonna get in. Okay. We do an HX get on the button, an HX swap to replace the button instead of putting. If you don't specify this, it'll actually put the HTML inside of the button by default, which in some cases you want, but you don't really want to fill the button with your HTML. And then, so this is the first input that you get. And then over here, we're using NTFY to send me a text message, or actually it's buzzing me like crazy over here. How does it work? Got like 10 messages. Someone tried to do an alert pop-up. That was pretty clever. And then
JS injection.
once it does this, then it sends back this HTML snippet, which loads the input again if you wanted to send another. Cool. Anyone have any questions? How that works? Okay. I have a next one, which is, oh, my photo gallery. Did this one on a train today because I wanted to show off. I've had kind of crazy summer. So I got a new job downtown. Just wanted to make a photo gallery to show people what life is. Okay, so what this one does is we're going to hit the button. It does a network request, which is going to send back some images of my life. So here's some of my friends at my job. This was last week. Look, this is how they washed the Chicago Fire Department boats. Anyways, just sending back a random photo. These folks had a really great time. Anyway, so let me show you the code on this. Because you would say, you know, these, I don't know, these days in programming, what you probably do is just cache all these front end and then swap them out on request. But this is actually sending them from the server when we ask for it. And so what I did here is just read everything from the names of the images so that I know what they are into this boring Express app. And then it sends the button which has the HX get for the images route to view the images. And then the images start coming back and you just send a random image here. And then this image, oh, it says HS get. I'm surprised it worked. Well, HS get works too, guys. And then my final example is going to be in a chat room. I like chat rooms. So last time I spoke here, I talked only about chat rooms. I promise I'm not going to do any cryptography today, guys. So, anyone know why that didn't work? Yeah, the stupid Zoom thing is in the way. So the error was Dino KV is unstable. So Dino was like, you can't use that unless you specify it. And here is a chat room with the QR code that's covered by this stupid Zoom thing. So if anyone wants to try chatting, this should work. I hope. It's oh, you know what? It's actually, I need to go to the actual chat app on the internet. HTMX chat. Dev. Whoa! So this is a chat room just using HTMX and a web page that subs in. Oh, yeah, come kayaking, guys. I don't know why everything else went away. That's kind of bizarre. Maybe I have a bug. It should keep.
Is that what the refresh button does?
Oh yeah, this refresh button actually brings the new things in. But I actually, the way I was like, oh, how am I going to do this in HTMX? And I came up with a kind of a clever. I'm sure some people will think maybe there's a better way to do this in HTMX. So we have a little feed render that happens here. Send each message, some HTML around it. And then this is that composer you type into. And then this is how I'm refreshing, guys. I'm sure someone's going to this is kind of silly, but so that refresh button just over and over and over again. Anyway, if anyone knows how to make a refresh happen in HTMX, like let me know. This is my solution. All right, that's the end of my talk, guys. Check it out. you too could be the CEO of HTMX for Yes.
Is this like a recent project or when?
HTMX, is it recent? I think it's 2020. The guy who does it, he did intercooler.js before this, which wasn't very popular apparently, but HTMX has taken off as, I think, kind of a backlash to the crazy amount of frameworks that are out right now. People being kind of, I guess they're like, oh, now I have to learn Next.js, and I have to learn Svelte, and I have to learn whatever. We could probably come up with 40 other frameworks that are out right now. And his response is like, why don't we do it this way?
And one other, is it all done through like ID and class tags on HTML?
That's how you target it. Yeah. So you would put a div in there somewhere. Or you can do it with anything though. Like any element is, you can just put an ID. And so depending on what kind of creative thing you want to do, you can pretty much target anything on it, swap. Yes.
So let's say you're doing a basic pattern, like you click on something, there's a loading state, the route changes while you're waiting for it to load, and then it comes back. Like, how do you do that sort of thing in HTMX?
I think in an HTA, you wouldn't want to change your route while it's loading, if that makes sense. Yeah, I think you kind of stop using the URL bar.
There's they have a loading spinner attribute that you can put on it that will then display the loading spinner, if you will, while the new data is being fetched and injected in.
That is a cool answer too. Yeah, I was looking at that and I didn't get a good demo of that, but there you can send, because of network latency, you would want to do that in some cases. Yes.
What's the best reason for me to use this over like another framework, and how much is vanilla JavaScript would I have to be using?
I think the idea to answer the vanilla JavaScript thing is for people to kind of get away from vanilla JavaScript and doing like DOM updates manually, or using some frameworks such as JSX frameworks to render stuff. And then how much vanilla JavaScript? Like I only use it once, which is to click that refresh button over and over and over again. You can, but there's one like ongoing debate that happens around HTMX is people want to know if it's a framework, and the person who made it, he insists that it's a library. So you can pretty much start throwing other stuff on there, such as vanilla JavaScript scripts, and just use it in conjunction with your HTMX stuff, and there's no problem with that. I'm sure there's no problem with doing that in another JavaScript framework, but I think if you're using Svelte or Next.js, you would probably want to use that throughout your whole app for everything, and not be just throwing some vanilla JavaScript in there. I think, I don't know.
So that uses in conjunction with like React or Vue.
I think it's trying to be a replacement for those things. I think you would probably not want to use a framework and HTMX at the same time, because it's doing doing the HTTP snippets approach. It's not going to be needing to do DOM renders the way that many of the modern frameworks do it. That answers the question, right? It does. Cool. Yes.
So to your point, it might be more effective to use this for something that's maybe more static, less like logic heavy. Like I'm just trying to imagine like the difference between like using a full Next.js application versus some of the things that you showcased here.
Yeah. I think the aim is not necessarily a static versus application. What are my thoughts? I think the idea with HTMX is you would be able to do all those things you can do in Next.js, but with a different approach. And you should be able, because of the being able to swap out any part of the page, you would want to do, but you would want to do all of your crazy compute stuff on the server side. And then once you have the answer for people, you would put it on their screen. Yes.
I know we're talking about accessibility a little bit later, and I'm seeing like all what HTMX can do. I'm just kind of wondering, okay, how is the screen reader going to react to this? And like,
Right?
how is it-
I wonder, maybe because it is re-rendering the DOM with all those requests. So and it is JavaScript that's doing it. So probably it may throw a screen reader for a loop. But the HX Boost example that I showed, one of the ways they explain using that is maybe you'd want to fall back to HTML, like a web 1.0 site, and for an environment that doesn't have JavaScript, you would be able to try to aim to do everything in a web 1.0, but then if they have JavaScript, throw HTMX in there, and then you wouldn't have the whole screen refreshing. But that you would have to, in order to do that, you would have to think about designing it that way towards accessibility.
I think the biggest issue with that would be browser knowing something's been updated, or the reader, screen reader knowing something's been updated. If you haven't gotten to that point in the application yet, then it'll just read it, or at least it should. I'm not the accessibility expert here, but.
There are some things like ARIA Live attributes that can indicate to the screen reader whether it should interrupt what it's doing to let you know that something is updated.
Yeah, I was thinking it
More passive and more aggressive settings.
like interrupting the reading progression more so than.
That particular thing is beyond my expertise. Yes.
So how far has HTMX advanced? Has it got like a dependency manager, a build tool, pages, components, anything like that? So we can do separation of concerns or
Does it?
one big file?
What is? Does it have a build tool? It doesn't require a build tool. Yeah, it's a library that you pull in as a JavaScript at the top. It's not very big. There are extensions for it to do server-side events and WebSockets that I haven't gotten into. But those would be kind of cool for me to investigate once, if I keep getting into this, who knows, maybe next week I'll be into something else. But did that answer the question? Do you want to keep going with the question?
Not opinionated. So if you want to do like server side, like organization of how, you're setting things like components, right? So like you want to set a specific component when you render pages, you kind of have to devise however you want to do that on that end of things. It seems like it's very straight. It's not like going to give you that full solution.
Another thing that I haven't mentioned yet is one of the reasons people really like HTMX is it allows you to code in any language on your server. And so a lot of people get forced into full stack JavaScript these days, and for people who want to code in something else, this is a great option.
You said that instead of like JSON, it sends markup. And I would have thought that JSON was like, perfectly fine, right? Because because I guess it's like it delegates to the whoever's using the API, right? How you want to what kind of elements you want to use for your data, right? What kind of HTML elements you want to use for your data, right? But with HTMX, it seems like you're deciding what elements are surrounding the data for the user. Is that my?
Yeah, well, you wouldn't with a JSON API, you would be doing those renders on the client side, right? And you would be associating the different elements with the JSON data and then rendering it into the screen. Whereas this, you're sending the HTML across the wire and then just putting it where you said it would go.
So I thought I thought I would have stuck with the JSON, from a design perspective. I would have stuck with the JSON, with the way that JSON does it instead of HTMX. So
There's
the rationale behind.
There's no reason not to use JSON if you want to. Just yeah, I think the HTMX argument is you don't have to. Just send some more HTML into the HTML page.
It's a circle. We're just back to server side.
I was gonna do some example where I used to code with like a PHP include at the top and the bottom. I don't know if anybody.
PHP's back. People are foaming at the mouth.
Yeah, that's like one of the things I do is like, oh, I'm a programmer now. I have an include at the top and the bottom. All right, do you guys want to hear about accessibility?
So purpose of this talk, accessibility kind of like primer overall. I'll get into some of the motivation in a second. I'll just do a quick intro. I'm Kaz. I like to call myself a product engineer. I'm not a front-end engineer, not a back-end engineer. I just like really working on things that users use. So like generally that means I get really good at front-end. But also like I want you to not be like very technology specific. I want
Webmaster.
master of web stuff. I like building things on the web when I say a product. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so be as good as you can at like the technology that actually helps you build useful stuff is the general philosophy that I want for you. That's going to lead into a couple of things that I talk about. What I do right now, I lead a team at Plaid. We build shovels for like the fintech market. Like if you use Venmo and you've connected your bank account, you're using Plaid. That's like our link platform. So Venmo is using Plaid to get the data from your bank. But before that, I worked at Amazon, TD Ameritrade, Upshot, Wolfram, all like in Illinois, almost all Chicago there, and then I have a website. More about all that stuff. Disclaimers about the talk. So I'm an idealist. Why is that relevant? Because this is going to be like a really, really deep topic. You're going to go, this is way too much stuff for me to remember in the next like however many minutes here, and probably take a long time to learn all these concepts if you want to. But the way that you're going to do that is by setting a really high standard for yourself. So again, be a product engineer, be someone who wants to build amazing stuff, and then just work towards that and let it actually come over time. Also, I'm not an expert on this stuff. Like I've picked up a lot of things over time, but I'm also here to learn. I might be wrong about some of these things. A lot of these things have a lot of nuance. So background on where I got started with this. Recently, I volunteered to be like the DRI, the directly responsible individual for accessibility for Plaid, which is like a bunch of different public surfaces we want to make accessible and pass audits and stuff. So this is an attempt to make sure that it's not just a one-man effort, because it really can't be. Like a lot of what I'm talking about here is organizational and teaching other people type stuff. So again, this is like supposed to be me equipping you. You have a tool belt now, and now you feel a little bit better about going to learn stuff in accessibility. So with that in mind, just a quick poll, I want to get a sense of how people feel. Raise your hand like I feel like totally comfortable with making everything I do accessible. Okay, more than I thought. More than zero is amazing. Not my experience. I've worked with accessibility related stuff. I've like improved it generally sometimes. I feel totally uncomfortable talking about accessibility. I'm missing some people. It's fine. So, okay, let me define accessibility. It's not necessarily an obvious definition here. So I'm going to define it at first as just the extent to which anyone, like regardless of ability or like any other factor, like the extent to which anyone can use your stuff, your application, your website. Also, if you haven't seen this, or maybe you've seen this and you don't know why, A11Y, I'll say ally a lot, accessibility. It's just 11 letters in between the A and the Y. I find a lot of people haven't come across that, so there you go. Also, by the way, internationalization, if you've seen I18N, like the React I18N Next library, that's where that's coming from, but it doesn't come to a nice, interesting word, so, or like a useful word, so I don't know why we did that. Okay. Lots of reasons to care about accessibility. I'm going to start with what I think should appeal to you. You might not agree. Number one, be a cool person. Like you should just care about other people. You should want everybody, like from an inclusive perspective, to actually be able to use everything that you build. But maybe like I'm gonna try to appeal to like a little bit of like your cutthroat sensibilities of like, this is a job and it's my 9 to 5, why should I care? So let's put that at the bottom of the list. Second is you have to by law. So in the US, there's the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. It requires anyone like who's basically a government body or a business that has anything they're offering to the public to have accessibility considerations. So businesses and state and local governments can currently choose, important to know, how they will ensure that the programs, et cetera, that they offer are accessible to people with accessibility or disabilities. So what does that mean? Because that's like more official verbiage. You have to make your app accessible, but there's no actual like legal standard that you can follow for that. Compliance is therefore like on a best effort basis. You just kind of like have to have tried, and you have to make a case that you tried if somebody comes at you legally. So most people choose to follow something that I'll talk more about called a WCAG 2.2AA, but they just get like a third party to audit them and then sign off on a document called a VPAT that says like, for now, things are accessible. That's how I feel about that. In the EU, similar concept. There's a law from 2019 that is in 2025 making everybody required to have all of their stuff accessible. But again, they don't set a legal standard. And so there's no actual like way of knowing what you're supposed to do specifically. So I feel about that way about that too. For that, WCAG 2.2AA is also what people are just doing. And because everybody's doing it, hopefully that's the right thing to be doing. It's good for your business. So in business terms, it's something total addressable market, like generally like the maximum amount of money you could make by selling to as many people as theoretically could be interested. You're making it possible for more people to use your stuff. And so, it increases your addressable market. So there's more potential end users. Also, if you're particularly a B2B business and they have end users, you're the people you're selling to, they might have requirements for this. And so that opens up a bunch of market opportunities. And that's actually the case of Plaid. So at Plaid, we don't care about this as much for compliance reasons as we do just to like make more money, actually. Beyond that, it's also a bragging opportunity. So Microsoft 6 years ago did this advertising campaign just for an accessible Xbox controller. And that got 2.5 million views on just like an ad that they posted. I don't know when the last time you went on like a YouTube video and like clicked through to the ad that was actually being hosted. It'll be like 50, 200 views, right? So like clearly this is something that you can actually brag about. To be clear, that's a bonus for sure. So this is the most important piece though. Making your app accessible is like a forcing function. So what do I mean by that? By virtue of making a really high quality product, by virtue of making a product really accessible, you'll end up with a really high quality product. It's like putting the reps in. Like if you just think as hard as you need to make something accessible, it'll end up really high quality. I'll put it that way. And in doing so, we'll talk about this concept. There's a specific term here. You will end up helping a lot more people than you realize. And like, if you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball. Again, it's like putting the reps in. Like you're going to do something you feel maybe at first is not relevant to everyone, but it turns out to be relevant to like everyone in making a really high quality product. Just to cover our bases here, I'm going to talk about like the broad categories, like in the official like documentation that you'll find for disabilities. So there's auditory to do with hearing, cognitive more to do with how the brain processes information, which is a little different from neurological because that's more so the physical, like neuron related stuff. It's a bit more physiological. Physical, so this is possibly any injury or any other physical ailment. Speech, self-explanatory, and visual, also self-explanatory. Just to note, as mostly front-end leaning people here, usually end up spending most of our time on visual-related considerations. But earlier I said it's not just about ability; it's external factors, anything that affects your ability to use an application. So I'm going to include screens that are small. That could be like mobile phones, smartwatches, like smart fridge, I assume. Like let's include that. Or like older people, they have changing abilities, and so they're not maybe used to those changing abilities, and that affects them. Let's call it temporary disabilities, like having a broken arm or lost glasses, something that's like very temporal and like temporary in nature. situational limitations, like you're just out like today and it's super bright and really hot, and like you maybe can't see your phone unless you turn the brightness all the way up, and then depending on the contrast settings or contrast for choices for something you use, you just can't see anything, right? Or it's like slow internet connection. Like let's include all of these different factors. But like, why bother doing that? That sounds like making things way too difficult for myself. So there's this concept. It's called the curb cut effect. Anyone know what a curb cut is? Okay, it's like a term I only came across in accessibility, but like you all know what it is. It's that thing. So I think we all probably implicitly understand that's mostly meant for like wheelchair users and like walkers, but I really appreciate a curb cut, right? Like I'm probably gonna trip in my life a lot more without the curb cut available to me, like out being used, implemented. So the idea is that it's a phenomenon of disability-friendly features that end up actually being used by a lot more people than they were originally designed for. So keep that in mind. It's going to come up very often in here. Examples of this, so accommodations that we all use like in the physical world. So there's closed captions, automatic doors, text-to-speech, ergonomic devices. All of us probably use all of these things all the time. The reason we have to have them is for accessibility reasons. They actually end up helping all of us. Similarly, on the web, some examples that I can see, if you make things accessible, information's a lot easier to parse. Generally, applications are easier to use like without the touching your mouse. Like if you want to be a power user, just be with your keyboard. Those things end up being a lot easier as a result. Any content that's interactive is just much more discoverable. Like if you've ever sat in on user interviews, like at the best of time, our users struggle to know how to actually use their application, or like, you know, struggle to find some functionality that's like what you think is easily accessible to them. And then also coming back to that, like, you know, high sun conditions example, they're more usable in those types of conditions too, right? Kind of bonus is if you use alt tags for a super specific thing, but if you like have descriptive text alternatives for your image, that improves SEO as well. Yeah. So how do people who have disabilities like account for that, and like how do they still use the web despite that? Two broad categories. One is just like using text. So screen readers were mentioned before. I'm going to talk about the specific question that was asked a little bit later. So three main examples: voiceovers for Mac, and then the others are, I think, platform agnostic, or maybe just for Windows. I'm not quite sure. Screen magnifiers, it's kind of like similar to Zoom, except it's more so like with your pointing device, you take something that's going to magnify a specific part of the screen. There are alternate pointing devices as well. So like sometimes instead of a mouse, like a wheelchair-bound person or paraplegic person, they might be using something where the like mouse is actually being controlled using a stick that they move. And then there's a lot of OS level configurations available too. So in CSS, if you've seen these media features, they'll come up again, but those are ways of looking up specific accessibility related OS level features. The other bucket after assistive technology is adaptive strategies. So, you know, cousin of the magnifying glass technology is just zooming in, turning captions on, or like reducing the mouse speed for some neurological or physical disabilities as well. Questions on kind of how we're defining accessibility. Very broad. Ooh, let's keep going. So, okay, resources to get you started on like learning about the space. So there's, I don't actually know how people pronounce the abbreviation, so I'm just gonna go for it. Web Accessibility Initiative is the Y. If you know the W3C, that's basically the standards body for HTML and CSS. So that the Y is from W3C, and that's their whole goal is to develop all of the accessibility, like technical specifications for the web as much as possible. That's the URL. We don't have time to get into it. I would love to actually show you parts of it. So the Y site, pretty general resource for just anything to do with like fundamentals of Ally, advice for how to figure out like, is your site accessible, courses that are free. There's some research that they've posted up there as well. From the Y, there is something called the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So this is the closest that we get to an actual even legal standard, but it's more of a technical standard. So it's a version standard document. It serves, like I said, it serves as de facto ally standards for the web. I'm just going to show this to you. So it looks like a boring standards doc if you've ever seen those. I don't know how much time you spend on those. You can kind of see the scroll bar on the right side. I submit that that's actually really big, as in the page is really short for being the accessibility standards. Like this is probably like toilet reading for a week, right? So I actually recommend you go ahead and read all of this. It's pretty consumable, and you can see like there's even a lot of white space in here because it's accessible. So go ahead and read that. It's good for you. We're going to talk about it a lot, and hopefully all of this, like how do I have a very accessible application, will make sense to you once you're familiar with it. So from the WCAG, I said it's versioned. Kind of interesting to learn the lineage of it. So 2.0 came out in December 2008, which feels pretty late, but finally we have it. It has 12 of something called guidelines. I'll explain. Then the next version came out a whole 10 years later and had one more guideline, 17 success criteria. I'll explain what that means. And then 5 years later in 2023, so last year, less than a year ago, 9 more success criteria were added. And so, oh yeah, and there's a breaking change version coming at some point in the next few years. It's meant to be like a ground up restructure. So everything I talk about structure wise and how to think about like addressing accessibility issues will change a bit. It's going to be more research focused, basically, the way they build it. So, okay, I said I'll explain that structure. At the top, there's 4 things called foundations, or sorry, principles, which are foundational. They're kind of adjectives for what your application should be. So it should be perceivable, it should be operable, understandable, and robust. I think perceivable is more like I can see and like actually get the information, like receive the information. It's available to me. Operable has to do with interaction. Understandable is more about the cognition and the neurological disabilities. And then robust is about like the various technologies, like assistive technologies that you use, that it's actually compatible with all of them. So there's just one success criterion under there, or set of criteria. So under principles, there's guidelines, which are like goals broadly. Examples for perceivable non-text contents like images. Can I like make sense, like actually find out what you're trying to tell me about the image or via the image? Can I navigate in my application? For operable? Generally, like, is it predictable? That's an example of understandable. And then compatible is the only guideline under robust. Okay, under guidelines, a success criteria. So these are your like specific testable like things that you can say whether or not your application is. So these are the actual like check boxes that you, as somebody who has to go and like improve accessibility, would do. And then they have something called conformance levels. I mentioned, you know, people go for WCAG 2.2 AA. So this is those conformance levels, A, AA, AAA. More specifically, the conformance levels, they're on a spectrum. So A is like stuff that you absolutely need in order for your application to be accessible. And AAA is nicer to have, but it's also like a lot easier and a lot more difficult, AAA, to implement. And so it also doesn't apply to everybody. Like, it's not everybody that should even try to be AAA compliant. It only applies to certain types of media that it's even possible to. So if you're, for example, like Twitch, and that's something where, because it's so video oriented and so interaction oriented and like live, it might just not be possible to be AAA. Or I don't know, but just saying it would even not be possible to be AA conformant. So bringing it all together, right? So how do we use this terminology? You meet a version of WCAG at a specific conformance level. So for example, you meet WCAG 2.0 AA if you meet all the success criteria under 2.0 level A and AA, right? So it's like umbrellas of things that you add more and more compliance requirements under. Alternatively, you can actually provide an alternative version of your experience that does conform to level AA. So you could say, it's not possible for me to conform to AA for some reason, but I will conform to A. And then if somebody tries to use a certain feature or like visit your documentation, you can refer them to an alternative experience that isn't like this web application, and that conforms to level AA. that counts. So like I said, most people aim for 2.2 AA, mostly government bodies that go for triple. Okay. Last like major grouping of like standards is accessible rich internet applications, or ARIA, or the Y ARIA is the actual name of the document. So it has three things that it creates or declares or tells you about: roles, states, and properties. And it's all about interactive components. I'll get into like why that's something we need in a bit, but if you've seen the role attribute or like ARIA anything in HTML, that's where that's coming from. And same thing I'll do here really quickly. This is the Y ARIA, similar style. Also, I would argue fairly small, especially because it's actually mostly, wait, I'm on, this is the vocab. Hold on. Okay, it's fine. It's just as long, and it's mostly tables. So just go through it. Like when you're commuting and stuff, you'll actually learn like, oh, there's this whole set of things that I can actually reach for in my tool belt now, and it's general. Okay, role categories. So it puts, like I said, it defines roles, puts them into like 6 or 7 different buckets. Yeah, 6. So abstract, you don't use those. Those are meant more for like categorizing things that other things fall into. Widget is like the actual like specific like buttons or like things built on top that you would use, like a tabs UI, document structure and landmarker to do with like marking content up, like section, main, nav, things like that. Slide regions was related to the question before, but that's for when things change. And then Windows, relatively new. That's to do with like dialogue, like modals and stuff, like things that float on top of the page. So states and properties. The difference between them is just, yeah, so states often change and properties don't really. Other than that, there isn't a difference, and we don't really argue about like which thing is a state, which thing's a property, but generally like they give information about whatever markup that you are using. And then it defines something called the accessibility tree. So just like, you know, you've probably heard of the DOM tree. So that's a representation of like your HTML like tree once it's parsed by the browser so that it can be rendered and manage events and things like that. Similarly, there's the accessibility tree. So this is a source of truth for assistive technology. That's the purpose of it. The DOM tree is not too suited for that. It's more for like event. And so DOM elements all have a representation because it's parallel. But unless you specifically display none, visibility hidden, or throw the ARIA hidden or ARIA hidden true on it, it's going to be in the accessibility tree too. And you can see this through the dev tool. So if I just inspect this right here, you can see there's the accessibility tab on the right, and that's a tree structure just like the elements tab. Thing to know about ARIA. No ARIA is better than bad ARIA. This is like a quote from the page. It's at the top of every page inside of the ARIA docs. Reason for that is once you put a role on something, you're promising that things function in a certain way. And if they don't, that's actually really, really bad. And similarly, like it's an override. So if you have a button and you change it to some like arbitrary role that makes it not seem like a button, but it's totally a button, now you've broken things worse than if you hadn't done anything accessibility related to improve things. Questions about all of that? Yeah, what's up?
The slide that you just said, like more specific with that?
Yeah, I mean, do you have any particular questions I can answer on it?
I mean, I just don't fully understand, like you're talking about the buttons, but what about other parts of the web page? Can you just explain that a little?
Yeah, so we will talk about like how to use roles a bit more. Maybe it's useful there, but basically like the short of it is we have things like buttons that give you functionality out of the box, but then there's a lot of widgets that you have to build yourself, such as like a tab list component, right? And you would use a role to tell the browser in the accessibility tree, this is a tab widget, not just a button at the top of like, you know, to click the tabs. But if you don't have it functioning the way that you said it would, now it's actually more broken than if it was just a button without any role on it, because at least for a button, I know I can click it. Anyone else? Okay. How to actually build accessibility. So before we are like coding, work with your designers. It's actually largely a design problem. If you catch it there, there's a lot less work overall that gets done. You hear the term shift left a lot in different contexts, and like the accessibility consultants will use that term in that way. Yeah, so it's still your problem. You have to actually be the one educating if designers aren't familiar. A lot of us aren't very familiar. Designers are no different. And so try to solve your problems in design space before code if possible. Depending on the specific type of disability, I'm just going to quickly go through these for time. They overlap a lot, and but almost all of the ones I talk about, they actually will help people who don't have any of these disabilities. So for auditory, don't just have audio at any point. If you have a media player, add some controls, and then add summaries. Like if you, for example, if you listen to a podcast, you'll find summaries there. So do that type of thing if your audio content's really important, and keep your language simple. I'm going to lump cognitive and neurological together here, but keep your content like simple and understandable the way that you do your copywriting. Hold your users' hands as much as possible is not advice specific to accessibility, right? Like we find in user interviews, people do the wrong thing all the time, and then you can actually kind of like nudge them in the right direction. That ends up being accessibility. And then also like if there's a toast notification or something where it's like limited time, actually like don't dismiss it if people are using it, right? If you have your mouse over a toast notification, don't actually dismiss it. And then provide alternative, simpler views where possible, but that's more of like a being excellent at accessibility thing. For dyslexia and for epilepsy reasons, avoid flickering content, like respect reduced motion, be careful with the fonts that you use, and like also don't overdo contrast. Like high contrast actually makes dyslexia people have difficulty. So there's a balance there. Physical, make sure that your like content is like usable without like needing a lot of like very high precision movement. Rethink your spacing. If you're using CAPTCHA, provide an alternative, and then support not just like the keyboard, but like try to make it so that various different input devices are usable. And then for speech, there's not too much to cover here right now, but if you use speech recognition software, be very mindful about which ones you use, and then provide alternatives to that. Like, if you have a voice application, also let people chat, for example. Visuals, like I said, where we spend the most time, there's certain contrast ratios that you can follow. Respect those OS level features or settings through CSS media queries. Set your font size and like line height to be like comfortable for everybody, and like don't do double column layouts for forms, for example, because then people have to like jump around a lot. So single column layouts as much as possible, and then screen reader support. We'll get into that a bit. Yeah. So that's the design side. What if you want to like actually now you have to solve things in code space? So start with good markup. So this goes into the whole like we're doing things old school. Like this, like the platform is built to work well out of the box. We do a lot of things now that we shouldn't be doing. So your HTML elements are the actual Lego like building blocks here, and CSS is just like the seasoning. So like it's called markup because you're marking content up. If you were just using divs and spans, you might as well just be using like plain text. The purpose of markup is to give like additional meaning on top of that, and that's for accessibility, but it's also just like the point of a markup language. So in principle, the way I want you to think about like what you're doing with JavaScript as it relates to UI logic is you're just backfilling widgets that aren't like native HTML yet. Like theoretically in like 2040, we'll have amazing widgets just directly through HTML for everything that you're using them for today. That's how I want you to be thinking. So all these other things, they're just kind of like an escape hatch, like the ARIA role, states properties, and like adding JavaScript functionality. It's all there to just like in the meantime support what you need. So pop quiz related to using the web platform. How many list container element types are there? So I don't mean like the LI element, I mean everything like that the thing that you wrap the LI element, or list items in, not even the LI element. Okay, well, I'm curious what the fourth is. So, okay, go ahead.
Three. We've got ordered list, unordered list, and there's a data list, right?
Description list.
Description list, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. So just, I want to really drive home the point that there's just way more stuff available in like HTML land than you realize. If you could go through the whole like MDN list of it periodically, which is a very strange thing to be doing, but please do it. You would think, okay, with this type of markup, is this not super restrictive to my styling if I have to, for example, for my key value pairs, just have them as a flat list, right? So why should I use this? Turns out they thought of that, and you can just arbitrarily wrap them in divs and spans as well, right? So just want to like really make you question like how easy it is to say, oh, screw it, I don't want to use the native HTML element because there's something about it that's inconvenient. Think about it. So another way to put it, start with like clean semantic HTML, have it make sense like on its own, like it's an article, blog, or forum post from when F was learning to code at age 12, when we were all webmasters and like CSS was just seasoning. So no like divs and spans yet, because those are kind of just for layout. Add containers like divs and spans afterwards just for styling and like general structure like layout. That's how you want to write your markup. If you do that, you're just going to be in a much better place out of the box. Other main tip, have good focus order. So people use their tab and like shift tab in order to cycle through all the interactive elements. So think of everything that's tabbable or focusable as like a table of contents for like things you can do on this page. All natively focusable interactive elements. So like buttons, form elements, things like that. Anchor tags, they're all already focusable. But if you need to make things focusable, there's tab index 0 to make something that isn't focusable. If you need to make something non-focusable for some reason, it's niche, but you can do it and you should do it. It's -1. Don't use any other tab indexes, please. It's an anti-pattern. Just make content be in the right order. If for some reason you need to tab in the other direction than the content, just like use CSS to make it look like it's in the wrong direction. Don't mess with the tab order. Okay, consult good quality resources. Like somebody just comes to you and says, hey, build this feature, this like widget accessibly. What do you do, right? I don't know if you've been in this situation. I've been in this situation a lot. So the YARIA patterns library is basically like a component library with a lot of different documentation. Let's go with accordions. And it'll actually break down the keyboard interactions that need to be in place, and then all of the different things that you need to do based on the state something's in as far as the HTML attributes go, like ARIA roles, states, and properties. So generally consult good resources. I always start there if they have something for me. But other than that, there's also Radix UI primitives, which links off to that same type of documentation from YARIA, and then React ARIA, MUI, Chakra UI, they're all pretty accessible. Okay, questions about like building things accessibly?
So how often do you find yourself doing some JavaScript gymnastics to make something accessible versus just like having the right markup?
Once you have the right markup, you have to do it a lot less. It just depends on like how bespoke, not a form button or anchor tag the widget that you're building is. And if you have a component library, you have to do it just once per widget. So. Oh, I'm not done.
ARIA hidden. Are there any, like you were talking about bad ARIAs, worse than no ARIA? ARIA hidden is one that I find people will like cram a bunch of info in and just like stick it in the DOM. Do you have any?
You mean people like have a bunch of text and then just hide it? If it's semantically useful, then why is it on your page if it should be hidden is my general comment. Like I find myself hiding like mostly images. Yeah, top level comment. Anyone else? So.
How about tools like White House? You'll get you. As I mentioned.
We're going to talk about tools quickly. Yeah. I don't mention that one though. I should. Okay, let's move on. Okay, last section here. Second last, I promise. Useful techniques. So this is like actual code examples. Hopefully that wakes some of you up. So visually hidden technique, there's actually something visually hidden on this right now. Let me see if this markup is big enough. Is that good? Bigger? Good, okay. So let's inspect that again. Yep, so we've got a p tag here, it's visually hidden. In this case, I just want to show what doing that looks like. It's not as simple as display hidden, display none, or visibility hidden, or aria hidden. There's actually a CSS technique, which in Tailwind is that class SR only. That basically, if you play video games and like you've seen something clip out before, same concept, where just it's there as it should be in the flow of the document, but it's just visually hidden. So screen readers will pick it up. That's what SR and SR only is. Skip links. So if you've ever Googled something and then press tab, you see like skip content, you hit it, skips the results. That's what that is. In this example, at the very start, I actually skipped to on the first page, I have a skip link to skip to this link. Basically, the idea is that the skip link takes you to the main content, because if you're using a screen reader, there could be your nav bar, which could be really like heavy in content and like all these other interactive elements, and you just want to get to the main part of the page. So that's what you would use those for. Similar to the visually hidden input using the visually hidden technique, you would have a similar technique on top of that called visually hidden input. So in this case, we have radio buttons. If you've ever tried to style radio buttons, it's basically impossible, so people have different strategies. Here, that's not an actual input radio, and yet when I click on it, and then like I'm just using my arrow keys up, down, left, right, I did not implement JavaScript arrow keys to do that. So the way that works is that I have a button styled for the actual marker, and then I have a label, which is labeling. So you can see here, there's the for equals option dash comfortable. There is an input element above it with the ID option comfortable that it's saying I'm actually labeling that. And then this input element is the actual input element that you're interacting with. And so behind the scenes, it's kind of invisible, but there's 3 different input elements. And by virtue of you being focused into one, although you can't see it, you just get all of the interactions for free because we're using the web platform. Like I said, CSS is seasoning. It's just there to make this look pretty. Link overlay, kind of niche, but I think you've seen this before. So we've got this card. The whole card is a link. And it's really just like this area, which is meant to be the link. But then I've got a hidden, like, or not hidden, I've got an embedded link inside of it, which takes you to a different place. You can't really see at the bottom left, but the URLs are different. The way that you achieve this is you have a before element on the anchor tag, which just through like position relative magic or position absolute magic with the card having position relative, takes up the whole space. And then when I tab through it, hopefully I can do this. When I tab through it, it just acts normal. It's like totally mad, like a niche thing that now you know. Roving tab index, something that component libraries implement for you, but it might come up. So when you have a menu element like this, there's many different focusable things. If I'm tabbing through this and tab order is like a sort of navigation or like table of contents for everything that's interactable. I don't want to go through like 100 different like countries, for example. And so what you do is you actually make all but the one that's being currently focused on be tab index -1, meaning you can't focus on it. And then if I was to just go to, let's see if I can do this. You'll have to trust me, the slides framework doesn't work with interactive things too well. But like I said, everything that is in there has -1, meaning it's not focusable, except for the one that you're interacting with. And so that way, when I press tab, I can just tab out immediately. And then when I come back, I should remember that that's the one I was in. And so because it has tab index 0 still. And so you pick up on that. Okay, so common pitfalls, mistakes that I see people make all the time. Big one is anchors that look like buttons, buttons that look like anchors, and divs that look and act like buttons. And then also buttons that make choices. So you'll often find like a button that's actually making, for example, like I'm this type of user or this type of user, and therefore I render this form below it or this form below it. Those shouldn't be buttons, those should be radio elements, and use like either the visually hidden input thing or use just like straight up radios, but like use the right markup. It conveys actual meaning to everybody, including people who have disabilities, but like everybody. So to that effect, like I said this before, but markup is there to mark content up, have it actually give the information it should. And then again, on this point, if it changes the view, which by the way, like if the whole view changes, please also change the route, then it's an anchor tag. I don't care if it looks like a button. Just style it like a button afterwards. And then if you're picking, like I said, if you're making some choice, that should be a radio element or a radio input. If you are clicking something otherwise, generally, there's a couple other clickable examples, let's ignore them. It should be a button. It shouldn't be an anchor tag just because you want it to look like just inline text, for example. You can throw in on click on a div, but like I almost never see this actually coming up. If you really have to do something where you think you need to do this, take a button, remove styles very carefully. Don't break all the things that buttons do for you accessibility-wise as they relate to style. Heading order abuse, don't have a nice demo for you here either, but like if you have an H1, the next type of heading should be an H2, and then after that it should be either an H2 or an H3. Like they need to have hierarchical representations of your content. They actually are a table of contents of sorts as well. By the way, like if you're using them for styling, because like out of the box H3s are smaller than H2s, etc., like you should just be using a style reset, and then you don't get to think about that anyway. But also do that for other reasons, like you should have easy to maintain CSS. That's part of it. Heading and landmark elements, like I said, they form the table of content. Don't skip heading levels. So again, like if you have an H2, you can't have an H4 right after that inside of it. I understand like if you have a component design or a design system or like component library, this is kind of hard to do because it's baked in. You got to design your component library to like let you declare what element type to render inside of it for different things to achieve this. So as is like the name of the prop that people often use. Anchor tag content, it needs to be like semantics. So this is a bad example that we all use, especially like internally, we pass a lot of links around to our coworkers. Here, if I just tab to it, it doesn't tell me anything about where I'm gonna go. You need to do some like copywriting usually to get this right, but the text that you have as the anchor tag needs to be what you are going to go to. So have semantic content. Icon buttons. So this is something Nikki asked about, like ARIA hidden stuff. So this is an example of that. This is like the worst example ever of how you would implement this. So you just have a button. You don't really need to see the button on the left, more so the accessibility tree. There's like no information about the label of it whatsoever. But if I at least put an ARIA label on it, now I can see the button's label is expand and it's coming from ARIA label, right? What's even better is if you actually, instead of ARIA label, just use the visually hidden technique. So there's actual text in here, expand, and it's just screen readers can still see it because it's part of the markup. And now we actually have like, just without using ARIA, no ARIA is better if you can achieve the same thing. And then when actually possible, like have companion text somewhere visible and then use ARIA labeled by on it. And so here also expand is there, but in this case, it's coming from the div that has expand on it via just connecting through the IDs. Similarly, we have alt tags for images. Similar idea, but like here, there's no alt tag on it, so it just says image. What's okay is like if these images are not something you're actively talking about, they're just there for dressing, then you can put either role none, which you see here, and so it's ignored. Same thing if you put role presentation. And then what's actually better is if you just have an alt equals empty string and React, the empty string goes away, it just turns into like a truthy value, but it gets ignored nonetheless. What's actually better if you have like content where you're talking about the image is to have like a real descriptive alt tag. So here you can see the Chicago skyline is like what we're talking about. If you can't see the image visually, you still know what we're talking about in the page. And ideally, again, there's like actual visible text, right? And then we just through ARIA labeled by still say that this is the description of the image. That's even better than the alt text, but you should also use the alt text. Charts. If you have a chart on its own, it's not totally accessible. There's some color blindness related things or like cognition neurological related things you can do to design it so that it's perceivable, but like it's not going to show up in a screen reader. What you should pretty much always do if you can manage it is have like the ability to toggle over to a table. Great example of the curve cut effect because like this is two different ways of slicing the same information, right? Also, I can copy paste this into Excel. So that's one way to do it. If you can't do this, visually hidden technique, stick a table right after and throw ARIA hidden on the chart, right? So like to the screen reader, it looks like the only content was the data in the form of a table. Live regions and alert mode. Let me see if I can get my screen reader running.
Element of the page to accept it. Toggle button. Toggle device toolbar. Toggle button. Panels. Tab group.
Is that audible?
Selected. Tab 1 and 2. Console. Tab 2. More tab. Kaz is 11 white chalk. Web content. Web tools. Web content. Kaz is 11 white chalk. Web content. Kaz is 11 white chalk. Web Kaz is 11. Kaz is 11 white chalk.
I can't
Web
do it,
content.
unfortunately.
You are currently
The slides framework messes with this stuff.
Voiceover off.
Okay, so So live regions, what they're for is when we're swapping or like actively changing different content, which is not the content that you're interacting with. How does the screen reader know that something changed? Well, it doesn't by default. Performance would be awful if it had to track the whole page that way. So when you have something like a toast notification that shows up just randomly outside of the flow of what you're looking at, you would pass in two things. One is ARIA live equals either assertive or polite. The difference is when this pops up, if it's polite, it's going to wait if it was talking already to be done talking and then say what popped up. Assertive, it's going to interrupt. So be very careful when you use that. And then there's something called ARIA active descendant, or sorry, ARIA atomic. If that's true, you're saying treat this whole bit as a new bit of content. Otherwise, it's just going to talk about the new text inside of here. That's all it's going to read. So it's just treat this whole thing as a new notification. In this particular example, because you're switching over what you're showing, you would throw ARIA live on here as well, maybe on top of some hidden text that says we switched over to a table, and then you switch focus to the table, something like that. PXEM, REM, Ms and REMs. I assume everybody here is like sometimes confused about when to use one over the other, because I am all the time. That's because you actually need to use all of them in order to support at least 200% scaling. The nuance is like, if you use M and REM in your browser, you can change the font size, that gets affected, but PX doesn't. Whereas Zoom actually these days affects everything, and that used to be different. So you actually have to use all of them, and it's just subjective based on your layout. So.
Correctly, I think this guy named Kevin Powell said to use REM for fonts and then M for like padding and margin, and then PX Burley or something like that.
That's generally right. Like M's, REMs for font, for widths, for padding. Sometimes it can all make sense. You just have to like actually play with your layout and see what is better. But generally, that's about right. Okay. Modal focus. So quickly, once you open a modal, I try to tab out of it. I can't. That's on purpose. That's what it should be. The other thing to know is that when I go into it, I focus on the first logical interactive element. If this was just like a confirmation modal, it had an OK button, you'd focus on that. If it was like a cancel on an OK button, you'd focus on the OK button, even though it's the second one, not the first one. Form names, give them names, you need them. If you use React Testing Library, you actually probably can't access your forms unless you do something like that. And you've probably achieved that by throwing a name attribute on there, but you should be doing something like this instead. Disable form buttons. I think this is the last example I have. never disable your form buttons. A lot of people are used to just like disabling them if like validation isn't passing. But in this example, like everything's filled in already, maybe because like this is what my profiles were set as when I loaded the page, and like I can't submit it and I don't know why. Turns out if I like interact with a bunch of elements, maybe I'll like eventually find out, not that you can see it too well, but like the text is too short. Alternatively, if you have it always enabled, this is like, again, like a great example of the curve cut effect. I don't know if your validation rules have ever changed and your database turns out to have invalid data and you don't know what to do about it now. One way to just work around this is to like, for a while, let users fix it themselves and they actually know what's wrong without there being any issue. This is the difference between users reaching out to you and maybe causing a 7. You have to explain to your PM why you did things poorly and not. Questions about all of that? So,
very last slide you just had, like, I'm not quite understanding it well. What gets disabled exactly whenever like?
The submit button at the bottom.
Oh, okay, so they can still submit it, but what's gonna happen to that data right there? They just enter.
So the point is that a lot of people make their forms non-submittable, and part of that is disabling the submit button if validation's not passing. Here, the form is invalid, but I have no reason to know that.
Oh, okay, I get it. Because it's just a bio. If they want to fix it, they can fix it on their own.
Yeah, and like I said, I would have to like go and like interact with all of these to like figure out why, because all of us tend to like wait for form field is dirty and also different and also focused into for us to start validating fields. That's how we tend to code them out these days. Yeah.
I get it more now. I appreciate it. Thank you.
How do you deal with accessibility when you might be dealing with two disabilities which have opposite requirements?
So generally, I don't. Can you think of an example where they would be opposite?
Sure. You mentioned that people with seizure disorders need you to stay away from high contrast, but older Americans need high contrast, or older people need high contrast to be able to read the text. So on one hand, you've got the old people needing high contrast and seizure that you can't.
So for that particular example, the answer is there's a balance. Like 7:1 is what for AAA compliance is recommended, and that shouldn't affect that dyslexia use case. But if you go like totally just full black on full white background, full black text, full white background, that's when it can become, and like very dense text, that's when it's overdoing it. So that's an example. In that particular case, it's a balance. I'm curious if there's any other ones.
Another example is the alt text for images. People who are born blind have different descriptions they would expect from an image from people who used to see and recently went blind. And it's like, you can't please both people at both, but it's like the balancing act.
Yeah, I think when you start getting to like, let's call them edge cases like that, like we don't know the answer. Like another example is I came across Reading, UK is spelled like reading. And that's not something that I can necessarily fix unless I just spell it, maybe REDDING in my alt text. This is something that's like actively being researched. We just don't have all the answers. Yeah, Alex.
I was just going to mention context for that too, is maybe who your customers or users are, right? Like when I was working for United Healthcare, like we had a variety of different use cases for accessibility depending on which app it was. So if we had a Medicare app that was like targeted towards fitness programs for older adults, our accessibility teams were informing us on a variety of unique cases we had to support. Whereas like maybe if you're working on, Chicago Lighthouse for the blind, maybe that's a separate. So sometimes it also comes down to who your users are.
Yeah, know your users, absolutely. Cool. Yep.
Question: is there any like tools that like, say for example, you could have like a script running on top of like your Chrome browser, like an extension that helps you with accessibility? Say for example, like how people say like there's two conflicting ones. Is there anything that like helps you use the website more accessible in a way?
If there are cases where there would be conflicts, I think providing controls absolutely nice to have. Just make them like discoverable. Don't use those plugins that people add just like an overlay for, because like you don't have any idea what they're doing out of the box. Like all of this stuff is too nuanced to just like throw a script on top to improve things. Yeah. Do you have a question?
I was just going to recommend, like, if you want to test that color contrast is good, try taking your laptop outside. Try using a website without a mouse and see how far you get. And those sorts of things make it easier to think about these sorts of accessibility issues.
Totally valid. Also, there's software for that, but in like a real world scenario, there's no second to just going on site. Totally. Okay. So last thing I just want to leave you with here is like, I want to go improve accessibility to my company. Like, here's how I'm thinking about doing that at mine. So start with the automated tools. Like, I'm not sure if Lighthouse specifically has them, but like different scanners that are dev tools, like they all basically do the same thing, which is HTML string in, violations out by parsing the HTML into like some object form in the middle. And they let you configure like, I only care about low severity things for now, and then scale up to like super high sensitivity or severity things. Here's a bunch of other things that will use those like HTML in violations out, so you can use them as ESLint rules. There's some standalone linters as well, browser extensions that let you say like, get on my page right now, just look at everything and tell me how it is. There's Figma plugins, Storybook plugins, Jest/vtest, you just like render your component and then feed it to some reporter. Similar thing for end-to-end, and then like all of these tools tend to also have CI integration so that you can block on your PRs. Automated tools only establish a baseline, like 20 to 30% of all of the like success criteria can be caught through like automated tools. So this is really just a baseline, but 78% of all the issues that you find only fall like into 5 different success criteria. And similarly, like the UK government like made the worst, least accessible site ever and used 10 different tools on them. In total, they still missed 29% of the issue. So just focus on these like top 7 success criteria, which is these ones, 30% just for contrast, and then adding names, roles, etc. is like taking you up to almost half, right? So try to just knock all of these out. People will be happy with you, and then you can focus on all of the fine tuning beyond that. If you have a design system, focus on that rather than like user land, just because it's not that like issues don't happen outside of that. Like maybe even most issues happen outside of that, but like the design system code runs so much, so like frequently in so many places that like the bang for buck is just absolutely there. The rest, unfortunately, is all manual. Like review all the resources I talked about, educate other people because it can't be a one-person job. Write about it internally at least, give talks internally at least. Be a line of defense if you see something happening that you're not happy with accessibility wise. I have these conversations daily, unfortunately now. And both for compliance reasons, but also otherwise, like run third-party audits. You'll learn a lot. Okay, additional resources, all of those. But otherwise, thank you.
And jump back to the additional resources. Thanks.
Yeah. The success criteria before, what's parsing?
Actually, no. You'll have to look it up. Yeah, I don't remember what the 4th guideline is either. Yeah, you'd have to look it up. I'm not an expert like that. Yeah.
It's kind of an overarching question. So, like, it seems like accessibility is kind of just, at this point, it's like, oh, think about it, like, go do something about it.
Yeah.
But it's not really super required. Like you said, even the government, there's not defined standards very well. Do you think there's a tipping point coming at some point soon where it will be like accessibility first? Do you think that's coming, or is it always just going to be do what you can?
So I don't know if the mic picks it up. So just repeating, basically the question is like, is accessibility always going to stay an afterthought in the industry, or like, are we actually going to properly care about it and make it a first-class citizen? Honestly, I hope that it's a first-class citizen. I mean, that's kind of how the law works, is that companies work on a bit of a profit motive, and then this is mostly seen as a compliance issue. like I said, if you can turn it into a business issue first, like it is fortunately at my company, otherwise I wouldn't care to be the DRI for it. If it was just a compliance issue, that's one way of actually motivating people to care about it. Yeah, but I'm skeptical myself right now, is the answer. Yeah.
Somewhat related to that, and being the local Svelte fanboy in the room, not sure how well other frameworks do this, just being honest, but Svelte built in a lot of accessibility best practices and warnings when you're doing things wrong. So I think the frameworks can potentially play a fairly substantial role here.
Yeah, so general comment, frameworks should help you, do help you. Svelte +1 on Svelte helping you with accessibility. In general, I think Svelte or like an approach like Svelte or HTMX is good because it forces you to use the web platform and you'll like end up by accident doing things better anyway. Or like having to learn in order to achieve what you're trying to do.
If you use React or Vue, there's a plugin for VS Code called the Axe Lifter. And that is a great thing to use if you're wondering where to get started. And it will catch you as you're writing markup, and then you can see the error immediately.
Yeah, Svelte does that off the shelf.
Awesome, yeah.
I intentionally did not name brand names. So.
That's what I'm hearing.
No, you're welcome to use it. It is the most popular one.
It's free.
Yeah. I don't want to be seen in public talking about specific business because I'm actually talking to them like for work right now. That's what
I see.
Yeah. But yes, that is the most popular one. Yeah.
Is performance and accessibility a concern?
How do you mean?
Like if you're shipping a 20 megabyte bundle, JS bundle.
Yeah, I mean, insofar as performance is part of our definition that everybody, regardless of any factor, should be able to use it. Yeah, and the whole point of the talk is like, you don't know how you're helping people when you decide to do accessibility well. You think you're doing it for one reason, you end up accidentally doing it for a ton of different reasons, or benefiting for a ton of different reasons. Any last questions? Okay, let's call it. Thank you.